In our time, the discourse around women has become a binary prison. On one side, blind idealization. On the other, corrosive resentment. But where is the honest reflection? Where is the psychological clarity? It seems we've lost the courage to speak plainly about female nature. Not to praise, not to condemn, but to understand. And understanding, as any student of Nietzsche knows, begins not in comfort, but in confrontation. Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the few thinkers who dared to look beneath the societal veil. He didn't romanticize women as angelic muses, nor did he degrade them into caricatures of blame. He looked deeper, into the psychological substratum where instincts, power, and survival play out beneath the surface of what we call love. For Nietzsche, gender relations were never about harmony. They were about strategy. Evolution didn't script romance. It scripted competition, adaptation, and manipulation dressed up in poetry. And perhaps the most unsettling truth, we still play out those ancient dynamics today, masked in modern language, sanitized by social ideals, but no less primal. This script is not a weapon, it's a scalpel. It seeks not to harm, but to dissect, to reveal the subterranean forces that shape desire, attachment, and control. If you've ever felt that something about modern relationships feels off, contradictory, or painfully performative, Nietzsche's lens will make it make sense. But it won't make it easier. Because once you see what he saw, you cannot return to innocence. You begin to realize that love, gender, and identity are not built on truth, but on beautiful lies we need to survive. Nietzsche didn't write for the comforted. He wrote for the awakened. So if you're still with me, if you're brave enough to trade illusions for insight, then prepare yourself. Because once you understand how Nietzsche saw women, you may never look at love, power, or even yourself the same way again. Section 1. The Fantasy of Woman. Nietzsche on Idealization and Illusion. You don't fall in love with people, you fall in love with stories. That's Nietzsche's starting point. He believed that men, when they claim to love women, rarely see the actual person in front of them. Instead, they fall for an image, a constructed idea shaped by centuries of myth, fear, desire, and self-delusion. And this fantasy isn't innocent. It's deeply strategic. It shields men from what they fear most, the unknown. Because the real woman, complex, instinctive, and inwardly sovereign, isn't easily grasped. So, they romanticize. They carve statues of purity, innocence, and grace in their minds, not to honor women, but to domesticate their chaos into something manageable. It's not love. It's self-preservation through illusion. Men, Nietzsche suggested, are not deceived by women. They are deceived by themselves about women. They sculpt fantasies with soft edges because the reality of feminine depth terrifies them. To Nietzsche, the popular vision of womanhood, as gentle, virtuous, and spiritually elevated, is not a reflection of women, but of male insecurity. When men say they adore women, often what they mean is, I adore the version of you that makes me feel important, safe, and needed. This isn't respect. This is emotional cowardice dressed as chivalry. You're not seeing her. You're hiding from her. And what happens when the illusion begins to fracture? When the so-called ideal woman reveals ambition, volatility, or sexual autonomy? Men call it betrayal, but betrayal implies deceit. Yet there was no deceit, only revelation. The fantasy collapses under the weight of her reality, and rather than admit that they created the fantasy to begin with, they accuse her of changing. But she didn't change. You never saw her clearly. Nietzsche knew this heartbreak well, not as an emotional rupture, but as a metaphysical reckoning. You mourn not the loss of the woman, but the death of your comforting hallucination. Women, Nietzsche believed, suffer in this equation not because they are hated, but because they are hidden. Idealization sounds flattering on the surface, but it is a spiritual cage. It flattens the feminine into a symbol, one that serves male fantasies rather than female truth. It strips women of moral complexity and agency and replaces their nature with roles: muse, mother, maiden, saint. To elevate a woman in your mind is to remove her from the world she lives in and force her into one of your design. The woman herself is gone. All that remains is the mirror you stare into, hoping she reflects your longing. This wasn't misogyny, it was a diagnosis. Nietzsche saw the delusions of love as more dangerous than hatred, because at least hatred acknowledges the other's reality. Idealization, however, removes the woman from the conversation entirely. You're not connecting with her. You're conversing with a puppet made of hope, fear, and projection. And if you ever wake up, if you ever let the illusion fall, you're left with someone you never truly knew, and perhaps never really wanted to. Nietzsche didn't say this to strip love of its poetry. He said it so that you could find truth through the poetry, not behind it. Because only by confronting the illusion can something real be born between man and woman. Section 2. Silent power. The female strategy of survival. You've been taught to see power as loud, armor-clad, confrontational, and physical. But Nietzsche knew that history's most enduring form of power was quiet, untraceable, and often invisible. For centuries, women were denied authority in the public sphere, excluded from war, politics, and institutions. Yet they endured. More than endured. They shaped history from the shadows. Nietzsche didn't pity this exclusion. He analyzed its psychological effect. When direct power was denied, women turned inward, mastering the terrain of human behavior. Where men were taught to conquer land, women learned to conquer perception. You think strength is in the sword, but they held the pen that rewrote the hearts of those who held it. They didn't choose manipulation as a default. It was evolution's answer to cultural confinement. Nietzsche didn't frame emotional influence as deceit. He saw it as strategy. In a world where physical dominance was currency, women adapted by mastering emotional economies. Subtlety became survival. They wielded charm not for pleasure, but precision. A glance, a silence, a calculated appeal to morality. These weren't accidents. They were crafted responses to a system that punished overt assertion. When denied control of laws, they rewrote the rules of intimacy. They became fluent in the politics of connection, where men remained blunt instruments of force. And morality, that became their stage. Nietzsche argued that women didn't preach morality because they believed it was divine. They used it as leverage. Appealing to conscience became a way to influence the powerful without appearing to challenge them. They became moral compasses, not out of purity, but necessity. While men declared truth through logic and conquest, women shaped it through nuance and tone. In Nietzsche's view, this was not moral superiority. It was moral utility. The idea of the virtuous woman wasn't merely something men projected. It was also something women learned to perform, precisely because it offered them a foothold in a world built to silence them. You've likely misunderstood this dynamic. You call it manipulation, yet it's no more deceptive than a lion learning to stalk instead of charge. Women, Nietzsche believed, internalized the psychology of power more deeply than men, because their survival depended on it. They became students of male ego, not to flatter it, but to disarm it. The power lay not in confrontation, but in calibration. She doesn't argue louder than you. She changes what you believe without ever raising her voice. While you prepare for the next battle, she's already rewritten the conditions of victory. Nietzsche never claimed women were weaker. He claimed they played a different game, and perhaps a more dangerous one. When denied the weapons of the world, they sharpened the weapons of the mind. You underestimate that at your own peril, because if truth is power, then so is the ability to shape what others believe is true. Silent power is still power. It simply doesn't ask for your permission to exist. Section 3. The Coming Storm. Independence and the Collapse of Illusion. You've been taught to believe that progress is linear and peaceful, but Nietzsche knew better. He foresaw that the rise of the independent woman would not be met with admiration, but anxiety. You weren't prepared for a woman who defines herself without you. You weren't trained to coexist. You were taught to be needed. So when she detaches from the scripts of dependency, you don't applaud her freedom. You feel abandoned. Because for centuries, male identity was built not on inner depth, but on outer control. Now that control is dissolving, and with it, so is the illusion that love was ever mutual in power. They don't need your protection anymore. That terrifies you more than you'll admit. Nietzsche didn't romanticize women's empowerment as a utopia. He saw it as a psychic storm, a clash of archetypes, centuries in the making. Women were always strategic, but now they no longer have to disguise their strength behind fragility. And that shift unearths your own fragility. Your dominance wasn't natural, it was circumstantial. The moment those circumstances changed, the imbalance was exposed. Nietzsche understood that resentment would emerge not because women were rising, but because men had nothing deeper to offer once their position was no longer inherited. There is no going back. If love is to survive this collapse, it must be rebuilt, not on illusion, but on mutual presence. No more worship, no more vilification. Nietzsche's challenge is brutal, but liberating. Face the other not as a savior or threat, but as an equal shaped by pain, instinct, and ambition. Both must shed their masks. Only then can something authentic emerge. Not love as submission, but love as recognition. And that clarity, though it burns, is your only real chance at connection.